Hello, I'm Meg Connolly with St. Louis University. Welcome to a special presentation on the history and traditions of homecoming. It really is a special honor for me to get to welcome you because Homecoming and Family Weekend has been a big part of my time here at SLU. And while we are certainly going to miss seeing you in person on our beautiful campus this weekend, being able to celebrate with so many of you virtually can also make this a very memorable time. To get things started, I'd like to introduce two amazing university archivists, John Wade and Caitlin Stam.
Hi alumni, I'm Caitlin Stam. I'm the current archivist for St. Louis University. I've only been here since January 2020, but I've really enjoyed getting to learn more about the history of the university, and I'm excited to share it with you today.
Hello, SLU alums. I'm John Wade, and I am a SLU alum, College of Arts and Sciences, 1973. I worked for the university full-time from 1974 to 2014, and I retired then. I was named Archivist Emeritus shortly thereafter, and I'm currently working part-time for SLU as the Outreach Coordinator in Pius XII Library. So again, welcome. Thank you.
So today, what we're planning to do is to go through the different traditions of homecoming and what they look like at different eras of the university's history, because it's not really the most linear of stories. There's not one just set of homecoming traditions, and it's really interesting to see how homecoming traditions have changed through the decades.
Okay, I think it's most of us associate homecoming, at least from our high school, and many of us from college, associated with football. And St. Louis U, a lot of people don't realize that. Many of our current students and even more recent alums don't realize that St. Louis U did have a pretty good intercollegiate football team from possibly even as early as the 1880s, certainly from 1899 up through 1949. And early on, it was associated with football. And as Caitlin mentioned, since we did drop football in 1949, so that contributes to part of this somewhat non-linear tradition at St. Louis U. But in the early years, at least we found evidence, I guess Caitlin, as early as 1923, 1924, of a homecoming football game at the university. And early on in the 20s, the university, I mean, many of our homecoming games were against the University of Missouri. I mean, we played Notre Dame in the archives. There's a program from a football game against Notre Dame when Newt Rockne was coaching at Notre Dame. And so those early years, and it was always this football game, and then gradually other events became associated with the homecoming, a dance, or sometimes parades. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through here.
Something that I was interested in was that the early years of homecoming, it looks like the dance that would follow the homecoming game in the 20s was really just the first major dance of the university's social calendar. So it wasn't really the big deal, I would say, that it became later on. It was one event among many with a large alumni-focused football game happening, at some point during that weekend.
And another interesting aspect is Caitlin was, I was thinking about this as Caitlin mentioned the dances. Remember in the 1920s, at least the arts school at the university was only young men were attending the arts school. And so a lot of the young ladies who would come to these dances would be coming from the girls' schools in St. Louis area, Webster College, Fontbonne, Maryville College, Notre Dame College in South County here. So that's where a lot of the young ladies who would come to the dances and attend these games would be coming from.
I've in going through historical documents, I've been laughing a little bit because homecoming is I think to us a really big deal. But in the 20s, they would publish an article in the paper a week or two in advance and say, show up to the game, it's the homecoming game, and wear a button that says "Hello Bills." and try to sit on the right side. So it wasn't the formal event that we think of it as. One funny thing that I noticed was that in the 1920s, as John was saying, many of the early homecoming games were played against Mizzou, but in 1926, they played against Loyola Chicago, and Loyola Chicago had a team goat for their football team. So the St. Louis players went up to Chicago and took the goat and brought it back on the train to St. Louis, and were hiding it all over campus. It was in a student's basement. Then they put it in the showers of the School of Commerce and Finance. And then they tied the goat to the goalpost during the game as kind of their big homecoming celebration prank. They should have really focused more on the football because they lost. But, so that was what homecoming was. It was really focused mostly, I would say, on the football game. Would you agree with that, John?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't nearly, and we don't want to just diminish the fact that there were, as Caitlin said, this was kind of the major, at least the earliest social event for the year. There were other dances and events that the university held as well throughout the year.
Okay, so moving on from the 20s to the 30s.
Yeah, in the 30s, again, homecoming was still associated with football. In those early days, and I'm not 100% sure of this, but I believe those games in the 20s many of them were probably played at Hanlon's Park or Hanlon's Field, which was over there on the corner of Grand and Laclede, a little bit east of Grand and in south of Laclede, more or less where the Marchetti Towers is now. But in 1930, I want to check my date. Yeah, 1931, they played the homecoming game at St. Louisans would call it Sportsman's Park, the first Busch Stadium down at Grand and Dodier, where the Cardinals baseball team would play eventually. And they had at least 10,000 fans show up. And then the following year, in 1932, there were evidently over 11,000 fans who showed up for the game. And you can see from the headline here, Monster Rally Friday will open homecoming. And as Caitlin said earlier, the headline there, it says, "Help beat Missouri Saturday," so that was, it was all associated football. And again, it was associated with football. But then around that same time, the university was able to open its own football stadium, Walsh Stadium, which is on Oakland Avenue. It's more or less where St. Louis U High's football field is currently. They're on Oakland, just a little bit east of the Science Center. And I guess it was, I don't remember the year, Caitlin, they got lights at the stadium there sometime.
Yeah, they were so excited. I think it must have been somewhere around the mid 1930s, because they ended up honoring at homecoming that year, similar to how kind of more recent homecomings are, where there was kind of a gala where people would come for events. There really wasn't one for the students. It was really for major donors. And so for one of the years in the mid 30s, they were honoring, I guess it was Mrs. Walsh, who donated money for floodlights. And they were delighted because they could play night games, and they were really special lights that you wouldn't have glare looking at the players, and the players wouldn't have glare on the field. So that was the big news of the day. So they threw that kind of homecoming gala in Mrs. Walsh's honor.
And again, to reiterate, St. Louis U had really very good football teams, and in addition to this homecoming game, they always played, or generally they played, a kind of their traditional rivalry game against Washington University over Thanksgiving holiday, and so that was always a very big game for St. Louis U, the game versus Wash U.
It's the Monster Rally that's being referred to in the headline of the school newspaper, which was then called the Varsity Breeze, is interesting because that was really the main student activity for homecoming around that time, before there were big dances where everybody could attend. The Monster Rally, they would have cheerleaders, and they're not what we think of as cheerleaders with pom-poms. They would be students who would come up with cheers for the game. And Friday night before the Saturday game, they would teach all the students at this pep rally all the cheers, so they'd be prepared to beat Missouri on Saturday. So that was the 30s. And then the 1940s looked a little bit different again. The 40s, at least from what I found, and John, I'm sure you can also speak to things that you've seen, it's interesting because there's a real difference in the kinds of events that were happening. Because of World War II, there were a few years that there was a break between homecoming occurring and then getting started back up.
Right. And I know they stopped playing football there for several years. If you go back in the archives and check, like there's no yearbooks for 1940, I know for 42, 43, and 44.
Right.
I think they started up again in 45. So yeah, obviously the war had a tremendous effect, well, first of all, there were few young men on campus because many of them were off in service.
It's interesting too. I mean, they recognized that too. I was looking at some of the headlines from the U News from the 40s, and they were saying in 1946, they had a huge multi-page spread in the U News saying, this is our first car parade for our first homecoming after the war, our first post-war homecoming. So there was a real excitement on campus about moving on, this post-war coming back to campus. So it's interesting. So the campus events really kind of got finalized. They would have big dances. There would be dances for reunion dances. There would be dances for the students, which is what you're kind of seeing on this page. And then also there's that car that says "Back the Bills," which there was a large car parade that would parade over to the stadium to play. Also in the 40s, there were bonfires, and there's a story about in 1947, the homecoming game was played against Georgetown, and the players, as their prank, they lit the bonfire before the start time. So everybody rushed and they missed out on roasting their marshmallows because the Georgetown players got there.
So the Georgetown players that did this? The Georgetown I had never seen that. That's interesting.
Yeah, 1947. And then what you're also seeing on this page are images from, unfortunately, the last game, the last homecoming football game in 1949, which was against the Davidson Wildcats, and it rained terribly. The whole game, as you can see in the picture, everybody in the stands with their umbrellas. They won the game, which is a good way to go out.
And that game was played, I'm sure, at Wall Stadium there on Oakland Avenue, I from what I've read and learned that after the war, the competitive, they had decent teams, but the teams were not as good as they were before the war. And the other thing, interesting thing to remember, is that in 1948, St. Louis U's basketball team, the Bills basketball team, that was the NIT championship team with Easy Ed Macaulay, and so basketball was growing in popularity. We had a basketball team since the 19-teens, but the basketball team was pretty good then, and so football was struggling. Basketball was on the ascendancy, and intercollegiate football across the United States was becoming more popular, and the bigger schools. Let's face it, football is an expensive sport to support. When you have to support, fielding teams of, at least 22 players, 30, 40 players, whereas basketball, the number would be much, much smaller.
It's interesting because what you're saying about the suspension of football, it really, I think, changed what homecoming looked like in the 50s.
Yeah, it certainly did, because in the 50s, we'll talk a little bit more about the Queen, but in the 1950s, the university started sponsoring something called what initially Founders Day, and then it became Founders Week. And what we were doing was honoring the founders of St. Louis U. This is always in the fall, in October or November. And they would always have a big dinner at the end and invite alums and other prominent people within the community to come. And then there were a lot of other activities associated with Founders Day and Founders Week. I know, for example, the Pius Library opened in 1959. The big dedication ceremony for Pius Library was held during Founders Week, and that time it was in November. Remember, in 1818, when the university held its first classes at Bishop DeBerg's little school on the riverfront, those first classes were held in early November. So that's this Founders Day, Founders Week was associated with that. Caitlin, you want to say something about these Homecoming Queen events here, though?
Oh, I sure do. I don't know very much about sports, but I do like the Homecoming Queens. It's interesting because it seems like the Homecoming Queens, and maybe John, you can either agree with me or maybe you have a different feeling, but it seems like from the research that I've done that the Homecoming Queens race really became the focus of homecoming.
Yeah.
The dance was known as the homecoming coronation. There were multiple queens each year for all of the different events. It was kind of a seasonal thing. There was a fall queen and all kinds of spring queen. There was a homecoming queen along with that. And it's interesting to research because I didn't realize that how hard students were campaigning for this, where different groups and dorms ran candidates, where fraternities would sponsor candidates to run for homecoming queen.
Not to interrupt, I don't know if you've ever seen in some of the yearbooks I've seen and in the U News, there was always what they called it, probably even in the 50s. I know in the 60s certainly there was the freshman pencil queen, where she would wear a crown and they would have these pencils sticking up out of it. But you're right, it became a really important deal, and more so even for the homecoming. To who was going to be the homecoming candidate, and very similar to what I think we remember from our high school days, where the homecoming king and queen was a really, really big deal.
Yeah. These are some pictures from the homecoming coronations with homecoming queen winners and the homecoming court. And then what you're seeing actually in that top left picture is the homecoming queen in the car parade. And there are a lot of images of car parades from each of the years. I think that they were playing at that point, it was basketball, and there would be these.
We never really mentioned that after football dropped, and we dropped football in 1949, the homecoming is associated with the sporting event was moved to the late winter, early spring, really late winter, associated with basketball games here. And many of these pictures on this one, and even on the previous page, the one in the bottom, the lower right, you can see Couples House, what we called the Shoto House at that time, in the background. And then you can see the Resurrection Seminary just to the left of that picture. I think that picture on the lower left, I suspect, I don't know that for a fact, but I suspect it's along West Pine Boulevard. Could you go back to the previous slide there? Is that
sure.
possible? Yeah, I mean, the three ladies and the queen at the top left. I mean, you can see probably Clemens Hall to the top, and the State Apartments building in the top right. Now, where the other ones were taken, I'm not sure. I know they used to have a lot of these homecoming dances and the dinners down at the Hotel Statler, which was downtown I think it's a Marriott Hotel. It's down on Washington Boulevard, actually not too far from the original campus the university was down there at 9th and Washington. But again, these homecomings in the 50s would have been associated with the Billikens basketball team.
Yes. Okay, moving on to the 60s and 70s. And John, I imagine you have some things to say about this because this is when you were at the university.
I mean, I came in 1969. Just a couple of things before, I mean, I remember on campus almost immediately, as Caitlin was mentioning earlier, the Miss St. Louis University contest and the different fraternities would sponsor different candidates, and then the homecoming dance or the Queen candidates. In 1968, ironically, the university resurrected football for a few years there. They had a club football team in which the students students would support the team with a fee. I remember we used to always pay a $2 per semester club football fee. And then again, homecoming for several years there became associated with club football. And then there's the football games, although I didn't play football in high school, I played basketball and baseball. I wasn't very good at either one of them, but I used to go to the football games, and they played the home games down on what we called Stan Musial Field, which is down where the Herman Stadium is, where the Bills play soccer. I can't tell for sure, but I think this picture on the top left there, that certainly looks like it's in front of DeSmet Hall, which would have been just east of the library. Then the parades, would have been, and as I mentioned earlier, would have been up and down along West Pine Boulevard there. And although they did have some parades, they did have parades through downtown streets of St. Louis as well. But again, there was this football homecoming, but they still, had some, homecoming event with the associated with the basketball games, and they were still holding these celebrations for the Founders Week at that time. Through the 60s and into the early 70s. But you have to remember that we're talking about in some ways, the middle of, the Vietnam conflict. 1970, when I was a freshman, was the bombing the United States bombed in Cambodia, the Kent State shootings. And so things like homecoming and dances and all that other was certainly important and didn't hold the same appeal, I think, to students as they did a few years prior to that. And I think, don't we have a picture of a basketball, I think, here?
Yeah. This picture on the lower right is the club football homecoming game in 1968. And then it was also basketball. This was from the basketball homecoming. It's interesting for me, just as somebody who wasn't at SLU at the time, to see the kind of differences of what was happening, where some years in the 60s and in the 70s, there was really no homecoming. In some years, it was kind of incorporated, as you were saying, into that Founders Day celebration, where it was Founders Day and homecoming. And then it was also a change in the time of year, where sometimes it was happening in the fall and they would have the club football. And I saw that they would also have, I don't know if you ever experienced it, or if it was not in a year when you were there, John, but there would be games, touch football between the Frost campus and the Parks campus.
Parks campus is right. And Parks, and that's something that we never, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit, but you have to remember that Parks College was operating on the campus in Cahokia, Illinois. Now it's on Parks College of Aviation Engineering is on the main campus. But they had their own football. I don't think they played football. They certainly played basketball and soccer. So they had their own set of traditions over there. In some ways separate from what was going on the main campus. But this is a basketball game where we're playing like the Drake Bulldogs, and at that time we would have been members of the Missouri Valley Conference. The other thing I should mention here too is that this period, although it's not associated with homecoming, the university had between 1959 and 1973, the university during that 15 year period, the university's soccer team, which just began play in 1959, won 10 NCAA championships at this time. And I don't think there was ever any homecoming events connected with soccer, ironically.
Do you know when they did, though? in the 80s.
Okay,
That was a
okay.
very good segue, John. Accidental, but it worked out. It looks like, from at least what I'm seeing, and I don't know if I know you were on campus then, John, working in the library. From what I've seen, homecoming took about a 15-year break, and then it was revived again in 1984. And
Not to interrupt you, but that's my impressions too,
okay,
is that after, my time as a student in 73, and I came back to work a little bit after that, I mean, there were certainly social events and activities on campus, but the notion about a formal homecoming was not, there wasn't anything there for a while. I'm sorry, but go ahead, Pete.
no, I mean, it's good to know that it's interesting to see, because it just didn't seem like it was a priority in what the students were producing about their own experiences. It wasn't in the yearbooks, it wasn't in the newspaper. In 1984, it was kind of a smaller set of events. There was a rally, a banner day, there was a tailgate. They decorated cars, and then they paraded to the stadium, and they played the Bronze Boot soccer game at Busch Stadium. And
the Bronze Boot soccer game for several years there was a really significant event. It was played against SLU Edwardsville, our rivals from across the river, and I mean, they drew over 25,000 people. And this was at Busch Stadium too, downtown. Just it's been torn down. It's just to the, I guess, the north of the current Busch Stadium. And that was the largest intercollegiate soccer crowd in the United States at that time. And I guess if we're seeing a picture, the upper right, that's the Bronze Boot trophy. Yeah. And hopefully people can see it at the top. You can see the little bronze boot at the top of the trophy there.
They played, that's from 1984. That's from that first year back.
Right. And since the Billiken players look happy, I'm assuming that we won that soccer game.
They sure do look happy. 1985 was the second year in the 80s that they offered a homecoming, and they did have a student dance. They had a gala at the Chase Hotel, and then they stopped again. It was kind of a stop and start decade for homecoming. After 85, there was no homecoming again until 1988, and they had reintroduced homecoming because students were complaining that there was really not enough on offer for student activities and fun. So this is why they kind of brought back the dances and the homecoming events. So in 1989, as opposed to being around soccer, they recentered it around basketball. So they moved everything to late January. So you start seeing all these pictures of people in the parades, in the snow. And that was the 80s. So it was, again, a kind of a stop and start decade like the 60s and 70s. The 90s, I'm sure, John, you can speak to, became kind of more like a week of activities as opposed to a game and a party, or a game and an event.
Right. And I apologize because I don't know the precise year, but in the 90s, during Father Biondi's term as president of the university, we start seeing the a little more formalized homecoming activities associated with, and here's some pictures. This is associated with basketball, but then we started having more formal activities associated with like a homecoming soccer game, and then we start seeing the homecoming reunion and family weekend idea begin to take shape. And then some of our more recent alums would remember the golf cart parades down the West Pine Mall, down to the soccer field, and we connect the homecoming not just with homecoming of alums, but also alums coming back to alma mater, to St. Louis U, but also for parents of current students to come back to the university, or to come to the university and have everybody celebrate together here.
Yeah, I saw a lot of things about what you're seeing in these pictures. There was a Twister tournament. They would decorate the dorms. There would be a dorm decoration competition. They would crown the homecoming king and queen at the basketball game. And then there were also homecoming Olympics. There would be blood drives happening on campus. So there was a lot of different week-long events. Something that I found really interesting was that so as we saw in the 50s, people got really dressed up for these dances. That was, they would get dressed up to the nines. In the late 80s, early 90s, it kind of started changing where there was a real, they didn't really know, there was a real range in what people would be wearing to these big parties. There would be almost like throwback homecoming dances where people would get dressed up in kind of retro costumes. People would wear, Hawaiian outfits to the luau themed homecoming dance. So it became much more of a celebration accompanying homecoming as opposed to this is the big event. And you see that reflected actually in the clothes. As John mentioned before, parks had their own separate open house and homecoming also happening in the 90s. And these are some photos of what was happening there. They would have skydiving demonstrations and a hot air balloon parade and air shows. And then in the 2000s, many of the things that people came to love about, as John mentioned, in the 90s, there were things like the golf cart parade. They really kind of became part of what we now consider to be part of St. Louis U homecoming.
Homecoming in the family reunion weekend. And yeah, you can see the golf cart parades here. The game, the middle picture on the top, it's at the Herman Stadium, associated with the soccer game, and down on the bottom pictures. The bottom pictures is as well there. And these, and I remember going to some of these soccer games here as well. Oh, and that's the other thing. I almost forgot about that. The fireworks were shot off of the top of the Olive Compton garage for several years. And then I guess probably this is a good enough time to say, during 2017, during the homecoming reunion and family weekend was the kickoff, the celebratory mass for the university's bicentennial celebration for 2017-2018. And then in 2018, we had the big celebration on campus where they actually closed off Grand Boulevard. And these are some pictures of the soccer. You can see the soccer game up there at in the top left, a family there, the Billiken on campus. You can kind of see in on the lower right and on the bottom left, you can see a lot of people in the back. So there are all sorts of activities, and this is more typical of what we think of as the current homecoming and family reunion weekend. Although unfortunately this year it's going to be virtual, but we'll do the best we can with what we have.
It was interesting for me to see, again, as somebody who's pretty new to SLU, to see how the events have changed. And the recent pictures, in the earlier decades, I didn't really see any kids in any of the pictures. It seemed like alums would come back for the game, they'd come back for their alumni dance or their, maybe a fraternity party or a sorority party. But they didn't really bring their family. So it's been really interesting to see in recent years how much of a family event that it's become.
It is, very much
and how great that is.
Very much so.
So it's something to look forward to for next year.
That's right. That's right. Okay.
And then of course we have to mention that last year, the Stanley Cup came to homecoming.
That's right. And Caitlin is a big ice hockey fan, but being from New York, the Blues are still the Stanley Cup champions, at least for a few more weeks.
4 weeks.
Yeah.
So that's homecoming through the past decades of SLU's history. We'd love to know more about the alumni memories that you might have. The archives are made up of materials that are given to us and donated to us. And so we can tell the experience of what homecoming and all kinds of campus experiences were like when we received them from our alums. So if you have any photos or course materials or memorabilia or anything you'd like to donate to the archives, we would be very happy to receive them and happy to discuss that with you. We are always looking to add to our collection so we can show people what the past and what the future and what the current experience of being at SLU is like. So if you do have any photos, whether they be digital or physical photos, or any kind of course information, or really anything else that you'd like to, consider donating to the archives, please let me know. My email address is here at the bottom, or you can get in touch with the archives, and we'd be very happy to discuss receiving those things from you to help contribute to the archives and to SLU's ongoing history. So thanks for letting us
very much.
be with you.
And again, please consider sending your memories and anything that you might have. At the time you keep something or you create something, you don't think much of it, but it really does mean a lot a few years down the road. Thank you.
Thanks, John and Caitlin, so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed this presentation and that you will be able to join us for more events throughout Homecoming and Family Weekend this year. Thank you.
Thank you.